Wyoming Territory, June 1881. The dry wind tore at her bonnet as she ran, skirts snagging on the thorny brush, heart hammering so loud she could barely hear the distant shouts behind her. Verona James did not dare look back. She had fled the church before the vows could be spoken, before she could be tied forever to a man who saw her as nothing more than a deed to a cow pasture. Her boots slipped on the dusty trail, but she caught herself, pressing on through the wild country. The sun beat down, cruel and unrelenting. She only knew one thing: she had to get away. By the time Verona staggered into the narrow canyon, her legs trembled from exhaustion. She slumped against a craggy rock, breathing hard. Dust coated her throat. She could still hear the hooves pounding in the distance. They would find her soon if she stayed here. A low whistle snapped her head up. Across the clearing, a man sat atop a dark bay horse, shadowed by the cliffs. He wore a battered, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a rough coat hanging off his broad shoulders. Even from here, she could see the gun holstered at his side. "Looks like you are running from something," he said, voice low and steady. Verona gritted her teeth. "Leave me be." The man nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Not aiming to hurt you, miss, just seems you might need a hand." She hesitated. Her chest heaved with the effort of breathing. Her head spun from the heat, and behind her, she knew, men were still searching. She pushed off the rock, staggering a few steps before her knees buckled. The cowboy was off his horse in an instant, catching her before she hit the ground. His arms were strong, steady. "Easy now," he murmured. Verona tried to pull away, but her strength had given out. She looked up at him, really looked, and saw a face weathered by sun and wind, dark stubble along his jaw and startling blue eyes under the brim of his hat. "My name's Xander Steele," he said. "You can trust me." She wanted to laugh at that, trust a stranger. But when he helped her up onto his horse, when he swung up behind her and shielded her with his body, she realized she did trust him more than the men she had known her whole life. He guided the horse deeper into the canyon, weaving through narrow passages until the sounds of pursuit faded away. Only when they were far from the trail did he stop beside a hidden hollow where a small fire smoldered low and a battered canvas tent slumped against the rocks. "Safe here," Xander said, dismounting and lifting her down carefully. Verona swayed on her feet. "Why are you helping me?" he shrugged, tugging his hat lower. "Figured you needed it." She watched him tie the horse to a scrubby tree and kick dirt over the fire until it was nothing but ash. Every movement was quiet, efficient. Verona pressed her hand to her stomach, trying to calm the roiling fear. Her father would be furious. He would send men after her. She had shamed the family name, but she would not go back. Xander handed her a battered canteen. "Drink." She hesitated, then took it. The water was warm but clean. She drank deeply, gasping when she finished. "Thank you," she said, voice rough. He nodded once. "You got a name, miss?" "Verona James." He crouched by the fire pit, poking at the ashes. "You running from a husband?" She stiffened. "An arranged marriage." "My father thought it would benefit our ranch." Something flickered in Xander's eyes, understanding, maybe even sympathy. "Well," he said, standing, "you are free now." For the first time in days, something like hope stirred in Verona's chest. She sank down on a flat rock, the weight of everything catching up with her. Xander moved around the camp, gathering supplies. He worked in silence, only the occasional clink of metal breaking the stillness. His presence was steady, unintrusive. It calmed her. As the sun dipped low, staining the sky red and gold, he handed her a tin plate with some dried meat and biscuits. She ate slowly, feeling warmth creep back into her limbs. They sat together in the growing dusk. Verona pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You are not from around here, are you?" she asked. Xander smiled faintly. "Drifted through, no place to call home." Verona looked at him, really looked. There was a loneliness in him that matched her own, a man without roots, a woman without a future. Maybe, she thought, that was why fate had thrown them together. Night fell over the canyon. Coyotes yipped somewhere far off. Xander added a few sticks to the fire, keeping it low. "You can have the tent," he said. "I will sleep out here." Verona opened her mouth to protest, but he shook his head. "Safer for you that way." She swallowed hard, touched by the simple respect in his words. In a world where men thought they could own her, here was one who asked nothing. "Thank you, Xander." He tipped his hat. "Get some sleep, Verona." Inside the tent, the canvas walls flapped softly. Verona curled up on a bedroll, pulling her shawl over herself. She listened to the crackle of the fire, the quiet rustle of Xander moving outside. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel alone. She drifted to sleep with the image of his blue eyes lingering behind her eyelids, and for the first time in her life, she dreamed of a future she had chosen for herself. Morning light slanted over the canyon walls, gold and sharp. Verona woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of a pot bubbling over fresh coals. She pushed back the tent flap and stepped into the cool air, her shawl wrapped tight around her. Xander crouched by the fire, stirring the pot with a stick. He glanced up, offering her a battered tin cup without a word. She accepted it, the metal warm against her fingers. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it cleared the fog from her mind. She sat on a flat stone nearby, tucking her legs beneath her skirt. "Where will you go?" Xander asked, breaking the quiet. Verona traced the rim of her cup. "I don't rightly know. I can't stay near Casper. My father's men will be looking." Xander tossed a handful of twigs into the fire. "There's a town west of here, Rawlins. Big enough to lose yourself in for a while. I could take you some of the way." The offer hung between them, heavy with meaning. Verona studied him carefully. His face was unreadable, but there was no pressure in his voice, no expectation. "I don't have money," she said slowly. "Didn't ask for any." Verona set the cup down, her hands trembling slightly. "Why help me?" Xander leaned back on his heels. "Spent enough years watching folks get trapped where they didn't belong. Figured one less might be worth something." She nodded, the words catching in her throat. Gratitude felt too small for what he was offering. The horse whickered from where it was tied, ears flicking at the morning breeze. Xander rose, dusting off his hands. "We should move," he said. "Safer to ride while the sun's still low." Verona packed quickly, folding the blanket with careful hands. She slid the canteen into a saddlebag while Xander tightened the cinch on the horse. When everything was ready, he helped her mount, his touch steady and sure. They rode out of the canyon single file, the trail narrow and winding. Scrub brush crowded the path and the ground was rough, but Xander's horse picked its way with patient steps. As they crested a ridge, Verona caught her breath. Below them stretched a wide plain, the grass rippling like water under the breeze. Far off, a herd of antelope moved in flickering patterns across the land. She leaned forward slightly, voice hushed. "It's beautiful." Xander adjusted the reins loosely in his hands. Hard country. But honest. They rode in silence after that, the only sounds the creak of leather and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. The sun climbed higher, burning the dew from the grass. Around midday, Xander guided the horse into a stand of cottonwoods by a shallow creek. He swung down first, then reached to help Verona dismount. His hands were careful, his grip strong but never rough. She knelt by the water, cupping her hands to drink. The creek ran clear over smooth stones, cold enough to sting her teeth. Xander filled the canteen, then settled against a tree trunk, his hat pulled low. Verona sat a few paces away, smoothing her skirt over her knees. "You said you drifted through," she said after a while. "Where were you before Wyoming?" Xander watched the water for a long moment before answering. "Texas. Before that, Kansas. Worked cattle mostly, broke horses, took whatever work needed doing." She chewed her lip, thinking. "No family," he shook his head once. "None left." The way he said it left no room for more questions. Verona tucked her hands into her lap, the ache in her chest matching his somehow. After they ate a quick meal of jerky and hardtack, they rode on. The land grew rougher, the trail narrower. Clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Xander pulled the oilskin from his saddlebag and draped it over Verona's shoulders without a word. He shrugged off the wet, his jaw tightening against the cold. By late afternoon, they found shelter under an overhang of rock. Xander unsaddled the horse and worked to start a fire while Verona gathered dry brush. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the stone above them. She sat close to the fire, warming her hands, watching Xander with quiet amazement. He moved with a kind of patient certainty, every action deliberate. When the fire caught and burned steady, she looked up at him. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said softly. Xander settled beside her, stretching his long legs toward the flames. "Maybe not. But I wanted to." Verona wrapped the oilskin tighter around herself, heart thudding. The rain outside blurred the world into gray and silver, but inside the shelter, the fire threw a golden glow over Xander's face, softening the hard lines. She wanted to tell him how much it meant, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she shifted closer so their shoulders almost touched. Xander didn't move away. The fire cracked and hissed. Verona watched the play of light and shadow on the stone walls and realized with a deep certainty that she was no longer running alone. She had found someone who saw her not as something to be claimed, but as someone to be protected. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe she could build a life beyond everything she had fled. A life that started with a man who sat quietly beside her, asking nothing, offering everything. The rain eased overnight, leaving the world washed and still. When Verona stirred beneath the oilskin, the fire had burned down to embers and the faintest light touched the sky beyond the overhang. Xander sat awake, his back braced against the stone, his hat low over his brow. She rose slowly, joints stiff, and crossed to where the horse stood tethered nearby, brushing its damp coat with gentle strokes. The animal nickered quietly, leaning into her hand. "You always treat horses that kind." Xander's voice was low, carrying easily in the cool morning air. "They never asked anything of me I couldn't give," Verona said, glancing over her shoulder. He nodded once, as if filing that away. When she returned to the fire pit, he was already stirring life back into the coals, feeding them with dry twigs he must have gathered before dawn. "We'll make Rollins by tomorrow if we ride steady," he said, adjusting the saddle blanket across the horse's back. "Town's rough around the edges, railroad men, drifters, folks chasing something." Verona tightened the shawl around her shoulders. "I'm not afraid of rough. I'm afraid of being owned." Xander paused, one hand resting on the saddle horn. "You won't be." The words settled over her like a promise. They rode west as the sun rose full, the ground soft beneath the hooves. The storm had left puddles in the hollows, and the scent of wet sage filled the air. Verona kept her eyes ahead, her mind churning. By midday, they reached a crossroads where a battered sign listed the distance to Rollins. A trading post stood nearby, little more than a low roof and a corral of rough-hewn logs. Xander pulled the horse to a stop. "You need supplies?" he asked. Verona hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't have anything to trade." He climbed down, tying the reins loosely to a post. "Wait here, I'll see what I can do." She stayed on horseback, watching him disappear into the dim interior. Several rough-looking men lounged outside, their laughter sharp against the quiet. Verona kept her chin lifted, refusing to meet their eyes. When Xander returned, he handed her a small burlap sack. Dried apples and cornmeal. Enough to last a few days. She opened her mouth to protest, but he was already swinging into the saddle, his expression giving no room for argument. They pressed on, the land flattening into open prairie. The clouds thinned, and with the clearing sky came a keener wind that tugged at Verona's skirts and made the horse shake its mane. After a while, she spoke, her voice carried away by the breeze. "Did you ever think about settling somewhere?" Xander adjusted his seat, considering. "Thought about it once. Had a place in mind, cottonwood trees, creek running nearby, never got that far." "What stopped you?" He was quiet for a long stretch. Then, in a voice that held no self-pity, only fact, he said, "War took most everything I had." After that, hard to think about planting roots somewhere. Verona nodded, understanding more than he knew. Dreams could wither under heavy hands. As the sun dipped low, they spotted a stand of poplars by a creek and made camp. Verona built the fire this time while Xander tended the horse, brushing mud from its legs. They ate in silence, the meal simple but filling. When dusk deepened, Verona sat cross-legged by the fire, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. "You never said what you plan to do once you get to Rawlins," Xander said, his voice low. "I thought maybe I could find work, sewing maybe, or cooking, something honest." "You're not made for scrubbing floors and sleeping in back rooms," he said. She looked up sharply. "And what am I made for?" Xander's gaze met hers across the fire. "More than just surviving." The words knocked the breath from her. She wrapped her arms around her knees, watching the firelight flicker in his eyes. "I don't know how to be anything else," she said, voice barely louder than the crackling wood. "Maybe you don't have to figure it alone." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the night. Verona's heart thudded painfully hard, but she didn't look away. Slowly, deliberately, Xander rose and crossed the small space between them. He crouched beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. His hand moved, slow and sure, to brush a piece of hair from her cheek. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle, reverent. "You're free now, Verona," he said. "You get to choose." Tears burned in her eyes, unbidden. She blinked them away fiercely. "And if I chose to stay with you," his mouth curved, not into a grin, but something softer, something that reached his eyes, "then I'd be the one thanking the stars." She leaned into him, the decision blooming inside her like a new shoot after a hard winter. His arm came around her shoulders, strong and sure, and for the first time she let herself rest there. The night deepened around them, the stars sharp against the black sky. But Verona felt only warmth, only safety in the circle of his arms. They said nothing more, letting the fire burn low, and for the first time, Verona knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. Morning light slanted low across the prairie when they broke camp, the coals from their fire long since cold. Verona gathered her few belongings, moving with quiet purpose. Xander saddled the horse, his motions unhurried but sure, checking every strap and buckle before offering her a hand up. They rode without speaking for a stretch, the horse's hooves muffled against the damp earth. The horizon stretched wide and clean, broken only by distant hills that shimmered under the rising sun. After a time, Verona shifted slightly in the saddle, her voice thoughtful. "What will you do once we reach Rawlins?" Xander kept his gaze ahead. "Hadn't thought that far. Maybe find work mending fences or driving cattle, something honest enough." She traced the worn leather of the saddle horn with her fingertips. "You could come with me." A crow called from a lone tree far off, its cry sharp against the quiet. "You sure about that?" Xander asked. Verona tightened her grip on the saddle. "I don't want to start this new life alone." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he guided the horse down a small incline where a thin stream carved through the land. They crossed slowly, the water no more than ankle deep. When they reached the other side, he reined in and turned slightly toward her. "If we do this," he said carefully, "it's a full measure. No turning back." "I'm not afraid of hard things," Verona answered. He studied her a long moment, something steady and warm in his eyes. "Neither am I." They rode on, the unspoken agreement settling between them like a sturdy bridge. By late afternoon, the land grew busier. Wagon ruts cut into the earth, and the smell of coal smoke drifted faintly on the wind. Verona sat straighter, nerves coiling in her stomach. Xander pointed to a low rise ahead. "Town's just over that ridge." As they crested it, Rawlins spread out below them, a patchwork of buildings huddled against the tracks where a train stood puffing great clouds of steam. Men moved about with purpose, and the clang of hammers and shouting blended into a restless hum. Xander guided the horse down the slope, keeping to the quieter edges of town. They passed a livery stable with doors swung wide, the sour smell of animals thick in the air. A blacksmith pounded iron on an anvil just beyond, sparks flying in short bursts. He pulled the horse to a stop near a boarding house with a sagging porch and a faded sign swinging in the breeze. "This place'll rent a room by the week," he said, dismounting and tying the reins loosely to the hitching post. Verona slid down carefully, her knees stiff from the long ride. She looked up at the weather-beaten building, then back at Xander. "Will you stay here too?" He nodded once. "Wouldn't leave you to find your footing alone." Inside, the boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and wood smoke. The woman behind the counter wore a gray dress stained at the hem and gave them a sharp look before setting down her knitting. "Rooms are $2 a week. Meals extra," she said, voice clipped. Xander dug into his coat pocket, producing a few crumpled bills. "1 room, 2 beds." The woman gave a sniff but nodded, pushing a worn key across the counter. Their room was up a narrow flight of stairs, overlooking the dusty main street. 2 narrow beds stood against opposite walls, each covered in a patchwork quilt faded with age. A battered washstand leaned in one corner and a cracked mirror hung above it. Verona set her bundle down carefully on the bed nearest the window. She peeled off her gloves, flexing her fingers. "We'll need work," she said, glancing at Xander. "There's a cafe up the street," he said. "Might be hiring help. I'll ask around about odd jobs." She nodded, relief softening her features. Together they could manage. As evening fell, Xander found a small general store and returned with a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a jar of pickled vegetables. They ate by lamplight, sitting cross-legged on the floor between the beds. Between bites, Verona asked, "Did you ever think about settling on a piece of land again?" He wiped his hands on a clean rag. "Thought about it today." She smiled, something shy and hopeful blooming behind her eyes. Wherever you are." The lamp flickered as a draft stirred the room. Verona set her plate aside, heart pounding. "I want that too," she said, voice steady. Xander reached across the narrow space, taking her hand in his. His grip was warm and sure, his thumb brushing along her knuckles. "We'll build it," he said, "together." Verona squeezed his hand, anchoring herself to the moment. Outside, the town's noise faded into the hush of night. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, work to find, a reputation to build, but for now they sat in the quiet glow of the lamplight. 2 people who had chosen each other against every odd the world had thrown at them. And that choice, Verona knew, would carry them through whatever came next. Morning broke clear and dry, the sky stretched wide and endless above Rawlins. Verona buttoned her borrowed dress, the fabric still stiff from disuse, and brushed her hair smooth before tying it back with a strip of blue calico. Xander waited downstairs, leaning against the post outside the boarding house, arms crossed loosely over his chest. Verona stepped down onto the boardwalk, drawing a steadying breath. She had an idea, one that had kept her awake half the night. "There's a seamstress shop down by the depot," she said, adjusting the strap of her satchel. "I can sew well enough to earn a place there." Xander straightened, his boots scuffing the wood. "You sure it's what you want?" She met his gaze head-on. "I want work that's mine." "Something I can build steady." He nodded once, a quiet approval. "I'll head toward the stockyards. Freighters need hands this time of year." They agreed to meet back by supper. Verona watched him stride away, his hat pulled low against the morning sun, before she turned toward town. The seamstress's shop was a narrow storefront squeezed between a grocer and a carpenter's. A bell chimed as she entered, and the scent of beeswax and linen filled the air. Behind a counter cluttered with bolts of cloth, a wiry woman with silver threaded through her hair looked up from her stitching. By the time Verona left an hour later, the woman had agreed to take her on for a probationary week, mending work shirts and hemming dresses. Wages would be meager at first, but steady. Verona clutched the small scrap of paper with the woman's scrawled instructions, and felt something she had not tasted in a long while. Pride earned by her own hand. The day wore on with the dry heat rising, but a cool breeze pushed down from the hills by late afternoon. Verona found a bench near the blacksmith's and waited, watching the dust swirl along the road. She spotted Xander before he saw her, his stride easy, a slight lift to his mouth that hadn't been there before. He sat beside her, resting his battered hat on his knee. Got hired by a freighter heading east next week, short trip to Fort Steele and back. Good pay. Verona turned slightly toward him. You'll come back, he looked at her, steady and sure. I'm not leaving you here alone, was thinking we could find something permanent after that. A place to build, her heart lifted. I heard of a homestead grant, 20 acres west of here. They're giving them to folks willing to work the land. Xander's fingers brushed hers lightly where her hand rested on the bench. You ready for a patch of dirt and a leaky roof? I'm ready for anything if it's ours. They sat there until the sun dipped low, painting the town gold. When they rose, Xander offered her his arm and she took it without hesitation. The following days passed in a steady rhythm. Verona stitched hems and patched trousers under the watchful eye of the seamstress, her fingers growing surer with each piece. Xander loaded freight onto wagons, his back aching from the labor but his spirits steady. Every evening, they returned to their small room, the distance between their beds shrinking until Verona found herself falling asleep with the sound of his even breathing anchoring her. On the eve of Xander's trip to Fort Steele, they walked along the edge of town, the prairie stretching dark and wide beyond the last lamplight. I'll be gone 6 days, he said, his hand brushing hers lightly. Might feel longer. Verona stopped, the cool wind tugging at her skirt. I'll be waiting right here. He turned fully to her, the starlight catching the rough planes of his face. When I get back, we'll make a start, no more drifting. She stepped closer, the space between them vanishing. I want that more than anything. Xander lifted her hand to his chest, pressing it over his heart. You're my home now, Verona. She leaned up, guided by something older than fear, older than doubt. Their lips met, soft and sure. The kiss was not hurried, not desperate. It was a binding, a promise sealed beneath the endless Wyoming sky. When Xander rode out the next morning, Verona stood on the boarding house porch, a hand pressed to her chest. She watched until the dust swallowed him, then turned back toward town, her heart strong with certainty. Days folded into one another. Verona worked long hours, earning enough to set a few coins aside. She visited the land office and inquired about the grant, her hands steady as she signed her name. She chose a plot near a slow river, the soil rich enough for a garden, the hills close enough for shelter. 6 days later, as promised, Xander returned. His face was sunburned, his coat dusted white from the road, but his eyes found her instantly. They met in the middle of the street, heedless of the wagons and mule trains crowding past. Verona laughed, a bright, clear sound that startled a few passers-by. Xander caught her around the waist and lifted her clean off her feet, holding her close. I got the papers, she whispered against his shoulder. Land's ours. He set her down gently, his hands lingering at her waist. Then let's go home. They packed their few belongings into a borrowed wagon, the horse slow but willing. The journey west took a day, and when they reached the small stretch of land nestled against the river, Verona climbed down and stood in the tall grass, the wind pulling at her skirts. Xander came up behind her, sliding his hand into hers. No big house, he said. No fine things, she squeezed his hand. We have enough. They built a small cabin from felled pines, the walls rough but sturdy. They dug a garden by hand, planting seeds Verona had bought with her first wages. Xander mended a broken plow left by some earlier dreamer, and Verona patched their clothes until the fabric shone with careful stitches. Each night, they sat by the fire Xander built with his own hands, Verona's head resting against his shoulder, their future unfolding slow and sure. Seasons turned. The garden grew. Xander built a chicken coop and Verona traded eggs for coffee and sugar at the nearest town. They learned the rhythm of the land together, the way the river flooded in spring, the sharp bite of winter along the hills. In the pale light of an early autumn morning, Verona stood at the cabin door, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Xander came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. You happy? He asked, voice rough with sleep. She smiled, leaning back into him. I am. His hand covered hers, firm and warm. And you? she asked. Xander chuckled low in his chest. Never thought I'd find a place I belonged, never thought I'd find you. Verona turned in his arms, looking up into his steady blue eyes. We found each other. He bent and kissed her slow, the kind of kiss that carried every promise they had ever made, every hardship they had endured to get here. The sun rose behind them, spilling gold over the hills, lighting the river like a ribbon of fire. The cabin stood solid against the land, smoke curling from its chimney, a testament to all they had built. Together they stepped into the new day, their hands twined, their hearts full, their home waiting just behind them and a lifetime ahead.